For me, the primary problem, everyone is reading the documents with the Bible in one hand. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to write books on Elephantine and to try to focus on religion. And then when they're focusing on religion, they, of course, have to gap fill because there's no clearly identifiable religious document from Elephantine.
Have we been misunderstanding the texts of Elephantine and what they tell us about the temple and community there? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. James Moore for a conversation about the archaeology, papyri, and community of Elephantine. What we know about them, what we don't know, where theories might have led us astray, and the context that we need to have to better understand this site and its material remains. If you are interested in the broader ancient world and the communities of the Persian period, I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and an exclusive bonus podcast every week where we walk through a chapter of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. You can also now find those bonus podcasts via our YouTube memberships. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the world of Elephantine. Dr. Moore, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today about a very fascinating, but possibly less well known to some individuals, site in the ancient world that gives us a unique look into the communities and lives of ancient people, the settlement, the site at Elephantine. So, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk.
Oh, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, Jordan.
For the very beginning here, can we start by setting the stage, giving an understanding of what this site is, where it is, and what we need to know immediately coming in, whether the individuals listening have a background and they're like, oh, I've heard this before, or if you're coming into this brand new, what are the essentials that they should have in mind for what they need to know about this place?
Well, Elephantine is a small island in the middle of the Nile River at the southern edge of Egypt. Today, it's just north of the Sudan. And it's often described as one of the islands right after the first cataract, which is difficult to traverse with a boat area of the river. And so it's a settlement that has developed on this island that sits across from a larger settlement known as Siene. And this was really the ancient city of the region. And Elephantine was just a temple island in the middle of the Nile, catering to Siene. It is a site that has been inhabited since the Old Kingdom and all the way up until the Arab conquest and through the Arab conquest, but it seems to have been uninhabited from the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era. There are many little islands in this region, and others have temples or chapels and things on them, but Elephantine was quite famous because early on, the temple to the god Khnum, the ram-headed god of the Egyptians, was set up there. Later on in its history, it will become one of the three largest Egyptian temple complexes in all of ancient Egypt. And so it has a prominent place in the history of ancient Egypt. What's fascinating about Elephantine is what's been found there. It's unique in both its Near Eastern and its specifically Egyptological context. In the Egyptological context, it's rather surprising to have a real-life glimpse into activities in an Egyptian settlement. Mm-hmm. Most of our findings from ancient Egypt come from tomb finds, and those are idealized versions of ancient life. The fact that we have continuous textual record from the Old Kingdom up through the Arab conquest in an active living settlement, and in this case a temple settlement and temple economy, is rather unique. It's paralleled really only in other like Mesopotamian large temple contexts. But the difficulty with the the site is that it's an island. And while in most mainland settlements, as the settlement grows, expands, and changes and is renovated over time, it's often easier just to bring in more material and build up. But on an island, it's easier to recycle. And so trying to archaeologically get the history of the island down and to stratify it has been a challenge since the earliest excavations in the early 1900s. And the modern excavators have done a much better job, but they still struggle at times to date things with great levels of precision. And for this reason, there's a lot of historical debate that then settles around the archaeology and the historical community of Judeans who are there in particular, which is, of course, why I'm here speaking. I don't really work on the older parts of Elephantine, but we have fantastic finds from the site in those earlier periods for sure.
The Judean community, I think, is, something as people hear might be a surprise to hear that there's so much outside of that, because for a large audience, I think a lot of our audience, like that's the part that they know the best. You've mentioned as well the textual record. Could you say a little bit about what exactly we have in that space that allows us to understand, like what types of finds do we have there?
From the Old Kingdom forward, it's all Egyptian up until the Persian conquest of Egypt. And it's Egyptian in a number of different ways and interesting things that you would expect a temple to have had. But then in 526 BC, Cambyses takes Egypt. The emperor of the Persians, Cambyses, he takes Egypt. And after this, we start to see an influx of Aramaic into the Nile Delta, or into the Nile Valley and the Delta region. And then eventually we find that it was by the middle of the 5th century BCE, almost all documentation at a moderate managerial and higher level is all in Aramaic. And this is a bit of a surprise. This is really sort of a shock to Egyptians in their own historical setting, one would think, because this is the first time in their history that they have to operate in a language other than Egyptian in their own homeland on a consistent level. And so you have all sorts of Egyptian records until the Persians. And when you get to the Persian period, we have a handful of Demotic documents, so the language of ancient Egypt, but the vast majority of these are in the reign of Darius the Great, and they start to dwindle immensely after him. And so there's just fragments of things or statements here and there. Now, to be sure, there's still a large percentage of the papyri found at Elephantine has never been read or published. That said, all of the Aramaic, except for maybe one or two scraps that might be left in some of those original boxes, are published. And so the focus has been, even since the early excavations of the site, to understand what was happening in the Aramaic documents. The documents consist of a variety of administrative genres, the Aramaic ones do, and there's only 2 pieces of literature really found at the site. Neither of these are what one would have expected, at least if you're an early colonial excavator. Everyone wanted to find Bible manuscripts. Mm-hmm. That's why they excavated there. The history of the site really began with purchases from locals that colonial adventurers and such had found or acquired as they're moving through the region. A large collection of these were found in right at the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, and this collection, through a series of interesting political events, ended up in the hands of a British scholar named Sayce, who then along with Arthur Cowley, the Bodleian librarian and Semitic expert, published the texts. And this is where we first really learn about the Judeans at the site and in large scale, and about the idea of a temple being there. From there was a push to excavate the site more extensively, or for the first time, actually. And there were preliminary excavations done by the French to make sure that the site could be fruitful, and they decided that it would be. And so in 1906, the site was divided between the French and the Germans, who then went there for a couple of years and dug immensely. Their digging styles were very different from each other, and of course very different from modern standards. But they split the site basically in half, and by chance the Germans found most of the papyri and the French found most of the ostraca. Everyone was a little disappointed because they were searching for Bible manuscripts. There's a temple to Yahweh, and they thought back then that the place you would find a Bible manuscript is in a temple. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's not what we would necessarily expect today, knowing a bit more about religion and temple societies and such. But it made complete sense. This was the age in which the critical assessment of the Bible was really at the forefront of scholarship. We're finding all sorts of new things in these colonial endeavors. I mean, the Smith sisters, of course, had found a couple decades earlier the Old Syriac Gospels, which changed people's view of things. Shapira is floating around with his purported new version of Deuteronomy, and so people wanted to find something really significant for the Judeo-Christian academic of the colonial period. And after a couple of years, they really sort of gave up because they were finding all sorts of things, but it wasn't what they were looking for. What they did find, the Germans published very quickly. Edward Zachau published a preliminary assessment of a few of the papyri, some of the more famous ones, and then the whole volume came out of all of the German papyri, or almost all of them, in 1911. The French drug their feet, and the French ostraca were not completely published until 2006. And so there's been a century of scholarship that went in one direction, and then it turns out, now that the ostraca are published, that we can probably really steer the ship in a completely different direction unexpectedly. The vast majority of the documents in the papyri are administrative. There's a large number of contracts, and then there are some letters, papyri letters. While in the ostraca, it's a huge collection of mostly what I would call missives. I use that to separate them from the papyri correspondences, but they're just small letters themselves. They have a different structure and formatting and purpose, but that's the vast majority of them. But then we have administrative ostraca, which are receipts and things like this. I'm sorry, not receipts, but lists. There's actually very few receipts, surprisingly. And then there's a bunch of vessel labels, which are very, very meaningful. Most people don't realize that in addition to being this Judean settlement writing in Aramaic in southern Egypt, at that settlement also has been found and the largest published collection of Phoenician textual objects from the Persian period as well. There's certainly other sites that have more, but they're not published. But there's around 100 Phoenician vessel labels there too, some of which are quite expansive. Others are just names or things like this. But so it is truly an international site that we encounter from the documentary evidence, and it's a really fascinating site to try to piece together deductively, which is my approach, deductively from the documentary sources themselves.
Can I ask a question on, you mentioned here that the types of documents that they find are largely administrative, and that those earliest excavators, explorers are searching for, hoping for biblical texts, which I think is something when people know about this, if they know about this in a connection of texts, that's one of those things that's like, oh yeah, there's not Bible materials that come from this, and that is to a lot of people surprising. Can you say a little bit about, given the context that we now know, as you said, about temples and the function of temples and the types of things, why that should or should not be surprising to us looking at the materials that we have and the context that they're coming from?
Well, there's probably two ways to approach this. First of all, Elephantine, the amount of documents and their focus on the Judeans living there, represents actually the largest focused collection of Judean life from the biblical period. So, in that sense, it has a lot of potential for us to contextualize what it means to be a Judean in the period in which the Bible is being edited and written and things. We now know from other sites, that there are other Yahweh temples in the ancient world. And if Elephantine has sort of a comparable site to look at, it would be Arad. And the thing with Arad is there's a Yahweh temple there, but there's also no Bible manuscripts, right? There's nothing like that. Most of it is administrative documentation. And when you take a larger Near Eastern approach, you realize that this is what the function of temples were. They were mostly community centers that built their own economies and community life, and their whole function was primarily administrative. In one article, which was one of the few times that I spoke at some length about the religion of Elephantine, I compared it in the opening to the site of Sippar, which is a great Mesopotamian temple that was basically closed down in the Persian period and then never resettled. And so when we found the libraries in the temple at Sippar, it was quite nice because it was all excavated appropriately. And what we found there is what you would expect in a Mesopotamian context, but I think for the Bible scholar or the religious studies expert, it might have been surprising. And that is, there's 90,000 or so administrative documents in the primary archive of Sippar. And then way in the back corner of this huge complex is a small room with a little library of a handful of literary texts. And these literary texts are standard canonized text already in the Mesopotamian tradition by the Persian period. So you just don't expect a lot of religious literature in temple settings. Mm-hmm. You would expect religious practical texts, songs, laments. You would expect incantations, any kind of therapeutic or medicinal type of religious type source. And we don't really have any of that at Elephantine, but we do have some allusions to some of that in the Ostraca, that activity was happening there. So you see allusions to a regular Near Eastern temple life, but you don't see Bible manuscripts, nor would you necessarily expect to see them. So,
mm-hmm. From what we do have in this administrative context, do we have enough references or materials to get a good idea of the daily life that it is portraying of this community and their connections with the temple or with each other? Or is it highly selective in what it presents to us about this community? Because as you've said, this is a unique snapshot into these people and their lives. So how much can we get from them, from these materials?
Yeah, well, this is where I diverge quite a bit from mainline scholarship. So, and this is owed mostly to the Ostraca and this sort of wider view of the Near Eastern context. For over a century of scholarship, everyone has argued that the Judean temple is basically a representation, or the documents discuss activities of private lives of Judean individuals. They all admit that the empire is there and that the empire has a presence, but all of the documents really are private and dealing with private business matters, et cetera, et cetera. This is in part due to a number of assumptions about the history of the site which have never been substantiated. The primary one, and this was put forth by Zachau in his original publication of the papyri, and then was picked up by the German historian Edward Meyer a year later, who wrote a fantastic little study on Elephantine, and that really set the arc of Elephantine scholarship for the next 100 years. And they both argued through a series of circumstantial pieces of evidence that the colony at Elephantine had predated the Persians, and that the temple had likely predated the Persians. And so when the Persians come in, they just hire these Judeans as mercenaries to guard the border of Egypt. There's no document that supports this from the site itself. There's no external Egyptian documents that directly support this. The archaeology is, as I said, complicated, but it's pretty clear. According to Cornelius von Pilgrim, the lead archaeologist there at the site and the one who actually convincingly discovered the Yahoo Temple's foundations in 1999, that temple, if it does predate the Persians, it doesn't predate Amasis, and that means that it's one ruler away, and it's not conclusive that it isn't a Persian period temple in the first place. So it's just the difficulty there in terms of that evidence can't be marshaled into a clear argument. The circumstantial stuff is also, I find it really difficult to imagine that there would be a Judean temple during the reign of an Egyptian pharaoh on the island of Elephantine across the street from the Khnum complex. It doesn't make much sense to me. What we do know is that on Siene, across the water, there are all sorts of other Persian period non-Egyptian temples associated with the imperial administration. Temples to Nabu, temples to Bonnet, temples to Bethel and the Queen of Heaven. These are Syrian, Mesopotamian, high-level ranking administrative officials who would be working in these temples, and also as Aramaic representatives of the administration through these temples in the Siene region across the river. Makes complete sense to me that the Judean temple is doing something similar, and it seems to be from the ostraca. That's pretty clear. That's what's happening. And so so if there is a private life, it's a private life under the auspices of the empire. And I argue that these are actually state dependents, that they weren't actually some sort of independent community, but that the documents really lead towards the direction that we know of from the rest of the Persian provinces, that the Judeans were sort of a planted colonial representation of Persian culture, and therefore they were state dependents, and their temple was basically monitored by the Persians, but they also helped monitor the rest of the region. And in some ways, they seem to have controlled some of the major resources that went to the Khnum temple. So things like firewood, for instance, which is very complicated. I mean, think about where you get firewood in Egypt and how do you get it, and but you need it. You need it all the time. And so it's an important commodity, a staple resource. And it seems to have been one of these things that the Persians had strong controls over, and they monitored it through these temple communities. And so the private lives are difficult to really describe. What we have in a number of the contracts are glimpses into a couple of families of prominent Judeans who were normally assigned by the Persians different types of property, whether movable or immovable. What I try to point out in a forthcoming publication is that it's important to realize that all of the contracts that everyone thought, again, was private interactions between businesses and families, they all deal with matters that are important to the Persian state. Okay. That is, property that is granted or monitored by the Persian state, either as rations, like granted to a community member as part of their payment as a ration, or are monitored for taxation, land, for instance. So those are the major categories that the contracts deal with, and the other contracts deal with the change in human status. So if a slave is getting emancipated, that kind of thing. And this is, of course, of interest to the Persian state, because this means also that that person now is taxable.
Can you unpack that misunderstanding, I guess, that has been rooted for so long, in some ways about the temple, in some ways about the types of documents, in some ways about, you mentioned like a garrison force here, I think is another one of these things that people have probably like, oh, if I've heard something, they're troops, this is defense system. Can you say a little bit about that part as well, and how you are seeing that old argument and your position on that now, given your readings of these materials, the archaeology, and where we should go?
Yeah, so one of the unique things about the documents is they refer to the community using what we'd consider military terms otherwise. So terms like army, and then two types of ranks of some kind, ranks that are thought to be units. Most of this discussion came in the early days of scholarship by imposing where these terms are found in the Hebrew Bible onto their meanings in the Aramaic text. What we know now, mainly through the help of Assyriologists working in the Neo-Babylonian and late Babylonian documents in Mesopotamia, is that, originally, particularly in the Neo-Assyrian period, well before the Persians and well before Elephantine and the Judeans there, society was often structured into military units and such, into these small military units. But that was taken over by the Neo-Babylonians, and then especially by the Persians, and expanded into all of society, whereby these military terms are used to help group different classes of state dependents, but they're not necessarily military in any sense of the word. They're just doing part of their tax obligation. I think the biggest problem is that most of scholarship assumes that taxes are just sort of a passive thing in the lives of the ancients. But the truth is, taxes come in two forms, both monetary, income tax, and probably the primary form of tax is labor and service to the state. And so under that rubric of service to the state is compelled to figure out a way to organize the people effectively so that that tax can be fulfilled. And so the state needs all sorts of things, but what we find throughout the empire is that the vast majority of things it needs are workers to clear roads and workers to help out with certain farming tasks and things like this, not to fight. And every individual who's taxable, I mean, the vast majority of them are not qualified to fight anyways in a effective way. So the Persians very carefully organized those who will go to military service, and then everyone else who's just doing their annual or biannual labor tax. And I think that's what we see at Elephantine is the temple is actually, as kind of expected, monitoring their own community who has been given state land. And in return for this state land that they farm, they pay their service tax. And so they also now monitor teams of Judeans moving here or moving there, or working in service to the state for their month or 3 month period or however long it was at CNA. and they have a foreman, they have rations that they're sending back and forth for these people. And that's really the structure that I think the documents portray. It's a model that we already now know very well from Mesopotamia, and it's happening there at the same time. And we know that the Persian administration is borrowing the Mesopotamian Aramaic administration as its model in Egypt. And so it makes complete sense to me that that's what we see in the, quote, everyday life, is just these colonial settlements that are living a life of dependency and service to the state.
You mentioned there that in understanding those terms, that there's that Hebrew Bible lens and translation that was applied to the specific language there for this community. And also some of that expectation maybe in, well, we think we might find these types of texts. How widespread has that influence been of like looking through a Hebrew Bible lens at the texts or at the archaeology? How widespread has that been on our understanding of this site?
I mean, I think that is, for me, the primary problem. Everyone is reading the documents with the Bible in one hand. And this was from the earliest publications, and even some still do this today. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to write books on Elephantine and to try to focus on religion. And then when they're focusing on religion, they, of course, have to gap fill because there's no clearly identifiable religious document from Elephantine. All we have are these passing allusions in other types of administrative documentation. And so they gap fill rather than maybe gap filling from what we know from Mesopotamian or contemporary sources. They gap fill from the Hebrew Bible, and that's where I just do something else. I just try to deductively figure out what's happening. What we find is in the temple itself, it's not so clear how religious activity, or that is life related to the idea of God and ritual and cult, was functioning. It does seem that there was probably the standard idea that the temple was doing votive type of activities. It does seem that they might have been doing the kinds of things that you would expect when a person needs psychological or physical aid and support. So, dream incantation or dream interpretations and things like this. Otherwise, it's kind of difficult to figure out what they were doing cultically. We do know that there was a handful of rituals, but it's not so clear how they were actually performed. And then it's also a big question of what role the temple played as a cultic site for the community, because it's on an island, and to get there you have to pay a boat and go over and everything else. And the vast majority of the Judeans appear to have lived in farmland off island, somewhere in the mainland, and this is where I would argue it's farmland that was given to them by the state, which is why they're paying taxes on it and things like this. So the temple does seem to have performed at least one temple-based religious festival. For a long time, everyone tried to manipulate the Bible into these documents, and some of them that refer to what may be alignments with biblical festivals in terms of calendrical times have been really contorted into the biblical framework. But from the evidence that we do know, the Judeans there seem to have only practiced the Marzeach festival, which of course in the Hebrew Bible is seen as taboo. They did do Passover, but if the Hebrew Bible is illuminating on what Passover is, that's not really a temple ceremony. That's something done in the homes. But Passover is mentioned a few times. Otherwise, there's not really much going on in the traditional biblical sense of religion or religious life at the cultic site of Elephantine, as far as we can tell.
In this unpacking of what's really happening at the temple, one of the famous or often discussed documents has to do with the appeal from this community for aid in reconstructing the temple and this relationship back and forth. Given, the fact that we might need to be reframing how we think about this site, its activities, the relationship with the people, how do we need to turn that type of reconsideration onto how we're understanding the meanings of that document or the requests of that document?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people that have written on this over the century and a quarter have really maybe unwittingly just sort of accepted the Deuteronomistic historian's view as historically accurate, that Jerusalem was a centralized temple of some kind. So the document you're referring to is a letter from Yedanya, the priest of Elephantine, to the governors of Judah, Yehud, this province, the Persian province, and of Samaria. And he makes a claim that the Egyptian priests had damaged the temple, and that it needs to be rebuilt, and that he had sent earlier letters to the priests in Jerusalem with no response yet. We then have a couple of other documents that confirm that there was approval for the temple to be rebuilt or at least repaired. It probably wasn't destroyed completely, it was just damaged. And that approval was at least bureaucratically accepted. Whether or not it was actually done is a difficult thing to determine. This is all happening in the last basically decade of the site's habitation for the Persian colonialists, and so there's a lot of cultural tension and conflict happening, and it's not clear how this is working. But the passing appeal to Jerusalem is really what you're referencing here. And scholars pick up on this and think, well, because DTRH tells us that Jerusalem is the central temple, it must have continued to be in some way and somehow authoritative, etc. I take a very different approach, and I explain it through the lens of administrative scribal culture, and understanding how the administrative documents of the Egyptian province, not just at Elephantine, but the other very large corpus of documents from Saqqara, as well as the way that we understand the Persian provincial system. I sort of frame an administrative scribal approach and sort of take that. And my argument is slightly different. And that is, Yedanya admits in the letter that that the Egyptians had conspired with the commander of CNA, that is, a Persian government official, and one of the main leaders of the region. And so they had no actual administrative recourse. First of all, they weren't allowed to build their own temple. It was damaged. They weren't allowed to use resources to rebuild it themselves. That just wasn't an option, which tells you how strong of a hand the Persian administration had over the temples. Mm-hmm. That had to be approved by the administration. So this is not a private temple, investment here. So they then probably appealed to the office of Arshama at Saqqara. That was probably their first appeal. They knew, though, that no matter what, the approval had to come from the Bureau of Arshama. That's just how the approval had to work. Like I said, there's revolution afoot. The Egyptian province had always been difficult for the Persians, and there's always rising revolutions, and they're quelling this. And we're at another moment in time where this is happening. So what Yadanya did was administratively appropriate. He wrote to his counterpart in the neighboring province of Yehud to ask his counterpart to appeal to the governor in the neighboring province to tell the Bureau of Arshama that the Elephantine site is a valid Persian investment, and if we want Persian colonial control of the region, we have to reinvest in this site. They didn't respond. So what does he do? He breaks rank and he writes to their boss, the governor of Yehud, directly, and says, I'm writing to you because I wrote to my counterpart and they're not responding. So that's how I interpret this. And it shows, we have other memoranda and stuff that show that the approval, that it worked. Mm-hmm. And the political leverage came from the outside, from Samaria and Yehud, and Egypt approved the repairs. So, I mean, to me, that's just how it makes sense. Now, was there possibly some sort of cultural agreement between the Judeans, priests of Yehud, of Jerusalem, and Elephantine? I have no idea. We have I don't see why there would be. That doesn't make any sense. That's not advantageous to Yadanya and his priests. So
right.
It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, there's certainly a partnership and respect and everything, but I mean, even in large temple communities in Mesopotamia, you see respect for each other, but there's not a subservient, hierarchy. So.
Which is feels like maybe a small shift to some, but also a very large shift in the way you reframe it by moving it into, let's look at this as an aspect of Persian colonialism, and the value of temples in that brings a whole new dynamic to the way that they're asking, what they're asking for. Should we take what they're talking about at face value in the dynamics between the communities here and there? Like it just brings in all new factors outside of just, if you step outside of reading it through the biblical lens, which seems to just enhance the materials that we have on hand.
Yeah, well, I was just trying to piece together for myself, really, a framework in which the documents made sense, because they otherwise did not make sense in their current discussions, to me at least. And it is probably more my problem than others. But what I found, as far as the way the Persians govern, or at least try to govern temples, it's been long known since the original publication of the Aramaic documents that the Khnum temple was controlled by the Persian administration, because we have a small dossier of Demotic documents from the sort of later period of Darius I, which is contemporary with the earliest dated Aramaic documents, basically. That is, there's no documentary Persian period evidence on Elephantine, whether in Demotic or in Aramaic, until really the 490s. And in the late 490s, a group of documents known as the Ferendata correspondences are these copies of decrees and petitions and such that refer to the appointment of the administrative priest of the Khnum temple. And they had to approve this with the Persian authorities. They couldn't select their own priest to run this without Persian approval. And this looks just like the model that was used in Mesopotamian major temple economies, where prior to the Persians, in this crazy imperial experiment of the Neo-Babylonian era, the Neo-Babylonians installed in the major temple economies of Mesopotamia something called a quipu, which was a imperial palace administrative official who sat alongside the administrative priest of the Mesopotamian temple, the Shatamu, and basically audited them. It seems that probably due to flipping Mesopotamian administration and economy upside down by simply taking and prioritizing the Aramaic administration of Mesopotamia rather than the cuneiform, it seems that the Persians took this position and simply elevated it above the Shatamu rather than having a partnership, and in so doing gave not just the economic control of the temple economies to the Khipu, but also the auditing of the labor.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you control the labor, it's an entirely different ballgame. And so that seems to be the model. Now, we also now know from other documents in Demotic that I think also in the era of Darius that the temple at Karnak in Egypt was also governed in a very similar way. And so it seems to be that the Persians used the temples as their basically their IRS and financial office, as well as their state recruitment centers. And the priests of those temples, which were approved by the Persian authorities, were living these double lives, right? They were the mediators between their own community and the Persian authorities. And this is a rather brilliant model of governance in a world where, sort of ideas of tribalism and isolationism and the other and everything are, for one of the first times in many of these settlements, being worked out as a variety of people are coming together, right? You have Babylonians and Caspians and Sidonians and Eastern Aegeans, Ionians and such, and then native Egyptians and all sorts of other people, all in this one little settlement. And how are you going to manage these people? They're going to trust their own kind more. And so the Persians used the temples as the vehicles to manage these people. And I think that, it's clear that they did a pretty remarkable job in that sense, and because they held together the largest continuous empire in the ancient world. Alexander takes it over basically, but it just is crumbling as he's taking it over, and it falls immediately after his death. And that was the only moment that something was bigger. But the Persians held this together for 200 years. And the Egyptians were a problem. The Egyptians are the only land in the Persian Empire to have ever successfully revolted.
What ends up happening to this community, to this site? Because you've mentioned here that this communication between the temples is coming at a time of uncertainty or change here. What becomes of this community at this site?
Yeah, so this is happening right at the around 410 or so, a little bit before that and into the last part of that decade. But around 404, a successful revolution in Egypt occurs, and an Egyptian rises to power, Amitreus. And Amitreus continues, as to be expected, I think probably not by choice, but by necessity, continues the Aramaic administration of Egypt, even though he's now an Egyptian pharaoh. And this continues for 5 years until Nefertiti comes to power in 399. And we have one document that is dated to the rise of Nefertiti in Aramaic, and then after that, the record goes completely silent. And so we can speculate what probably happened, but the Aramaic record throughout the entire Nile Valley, it seems, went silent at this period, including into the delta at Saqqara. And so what probably happened is after 5 years of Egyptianizing, again, under Amitreus, Nefertiti just pulled the trigger and changed everything back to Demotic. Now, what happened to the people at Elephantine the colonial settlements at Elephantine and Siena is anyone's guess, but you have really one of three options. They were either forced to assimilate, they were either expelled or murdered. And either way, the people in charge were no longer in charge. So even if those communities or remnants of those communities were still around, their leaders are gone. Now, the Persians will retake Egypt at the end of the reign of Nectanebo II, and Artaxerxes III will come back in for the second Persian period of Egypt. But there's no indication, as far as we know, in terms of documents or archaeology, that this had any real effect in the southern part of Egypt. This was probably mostly centered around the northern part of Egypt and the Delta, and at Saqqara, and maybe stretched into Thebes, central Egypt. But it doesn't seem to have really taken hold. And that lasted only about a decade, and then Alexander comes in. And then after him, the Ptolemies basically continue the Aramaic administration, but in Greek. And then they slowly streamline it for their own means, but it's basically all Persian administration, but in Greek.
Well, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for coming today to walk through this site, its materials, and its culture, because I find your reframing of this within that Persian context to be, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it does break away some of the issues with older models. I look forward to your upcoming work on this. So if you guys are interested in learning more about this, we'll have some links down below for things. You can go and read some updates in the future when things come out. But Dr. Moore, thank you so much for taking the time to come today to talk with us a little bit about this site, its people, its legacy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan. It's been a pleasure.
For all of you listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, that's all we have. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.